joined today with Scott Kelly, who is a coach working with nutrition and lifestyle. And he came across the 3 principles while he was looking at nutrition and trying to think of discovering that when it comes to health, not one size fits all. And I just wondered, Scott, if you'd like to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for the opportunity to connect. I look forward to our conversation. Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of background of kind of where I came from as far as my career and where I am now. But about 25 years ago, I was really intrigued with health and healing, but really from the physical body standpoint. I was really looking at how joints work and how they heal, and was really involved in physiotherapy and sports therapy, and spent really all of my time drilling down further and further into specific joints and kinesiology. And I got a little kind of disenchanted with not only the way that I was taught, but the outcomes that I could get with people, because I found that the further and more specific I got with people, the less possibility we saw with their outcome. And so I started to get intrigued with nutrition. And I thought, a couple of mentors of mine had kind of pointed in this direction of, very simply, that the only thing that our body has to build and rebuild tissue and build and rebuild health from the inside out was the food that we put in. And the quality of the tissue that we could build was really reflective of the quality of the food that we put in our body. And that point just so intrigued me that I started to look further and further into generating health by putting foods that are close to nature and whole foods and anti-inflammatory foods, and started to recognize very, very quickly that when the body is filled with nutrients and nutrient-dense foods, so much of the lifting around health and healing is done. The body does it really, really well. And so as I continued on that pathway, I started to recognize that it wasn't always just being able to tell people what to eat and what not to eat, that people were going to do what they were going to do. And I wanted to figure out, well, what would help people change their behavior? And that really took me into the world of NLP and hypnosis and working in that realm, looking at how we could help change people's minds so that they could choose foods really that were going to be better for their body. But in that process, I really started to recognize the impact that our psychology has on our overall health, well-being, physiology, capacity to absorb nutrients and choose foods. And it really intrigued me. And so all along this process, it was kind of like my career started by drilling down deeper and deeper into the body and making the body kind of smaller and smaller. But reaching a dead end, it was like, as I started to pull the lens back further and further and further, and started to realize, life is so much bigger than joints. It's so much bigger than cells. It's so much bigger than food. It's so much bigger than our thinking. It's so much bigger than that I got really, really intrigued with what else was also true. And my life has always been really intrigued by consciousness somehow, some way. And I remember even back when I was probably 18, 19 years old, reading books that were kind of in and around Eastern philosophy, but I never could really make sense of it at all. And in the early 90s, a friend of mine gave me, a friend of mine who was really into health realization. And I had no idea what that was, but he thought health realization was the coolest thing. And he tried to explain it to me. He gave me a book, and I read the book, and the book just kind of went over my head, and I put the book on my shelf, and really never really thought much about it again. And that was in the early 90s. And then in around 2000, around somewhere around 2010, I came across a podcast, and somebody said something about we're living in the feeling of our thinking. And I know Michael Neal has said that many times. I'm not even sure if it was him that said it at the time that I was listening to the podcast. But he also said something about Dicken Bettinger, and that name rang a bell at the time as well, because my friend had spoken about Dicken. And so I literally rifled through my bookshelf, and I was looking for this book that he gave me back in the early 90s. And I found the book, and I pulled it off the shelf, and it was a book by Sydney Banks called Second Chance. And so I sat down and I reread the book, and it just smacked me right between the eyes. And from that point on, I knew that health was something that was innate. And it just spoke so deeply to what I couldn't articulate, but knew that was true already. And that there was an innate capacity for all of us to heal in any given moment of time. And it really was much more about, less about techniques and strategies, and much more about the synchronization of ourselves with nature, and seeing ourselves as nature, as a wonderful piece of nature that's expanding in its own consciousness. And the more I saw that, the more the things that I was doing in and around techniques and strategies to help people heal, they suddenly just didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And that it really revolved around helping people see their true innate health, while at the same time looking in the direction of how nutrition can facilitate that in the physical form. And as all those components kind of came together as they did, and as they continue to, I started to find that healing is a lot less mysterious, and perhaps even less complicated, and that the most complicated thing in the healing equation is the constructs that we create, and the difficult thinking that we have about healing and health. And as soon as those things are loosened up a little bit, health and healing want to happen, and health and healing want to be expressed. And so that's kind of where I am now, and that's where I find myself working with people, is kind of helping them pull the lens back from wherever they are on their health and healing journey, wherever they are in their health and performance journey, and recognizing what's already true and innate, what already wants to be expressed, and then simply kind of falling into the passenger seat and letting that part of them do the heavier lifting.
So if you had someone, for example, I know somebody who's got fibromyalgia, how would you, I'm just using this as an example, and they came to see you asking for help with their nutrition and their well-being, how would you start with someone like that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to honor. Well, first of all, I see the body as an expression of energy. The body is an expression of consciousness, and it's an expression of energy. And we oftentimes talk about the form and the formless sides of our life experience. And the body is really, it's really just energy at a different frequency. And so starting with that premise, we also have to honor the fact that the way that this body finds health and success in the world of form is through its connection with nature and its connection with nutrition. And there are things that get in the way of that fluidity and that expression. There are things that get in the way, like environmental toxins get in the way. Inflammatory foods get in the way. Foods that are over processed and have lots of additives and preservatives and herbicides and pesticides. These are all things that simply get in the way of a body being able to express itself more effortlessly. And so one of the things that's really helpful, a helpful place to begin is for me, is to understand where somebody is in relationship to food and nature. And are they taking in foods that are in alignment with vitality and health and well-being? Or are there more foods going in that are literally robbing their body of nutrients and robbing their body of vitality, and at the same time generating inflammation in the body? So that's the first step, is to really just kind of assess and kind of do some intake and figure out where they are. The other part is understanding environment. What is the environment in which this person lives? Because if they live in a toxic environment, if they live in proximity to farms that are using herbicides and pesticides, golf courses that use lots of herbicides and pesticides, working in office spaces where there's higher levels of toxicity, off-gassing of things, those things oftentimes interfere with the physical body. So it is important to consider many, many aspects of where somebody is in their health journey, their living environment, their sleep environment, how they feed themselves, what they have access to. And then the other part is doing intake to understand their relationship with their health. And one of the things that I have found on my journey is that more and more, I find that people are really kind of more disembodied, and meaning that they don't inhabit their bodies very well. They're kind of, oftentimes, I even find it with people when they start to kind of see more of the spiritual nature of life. Sometimes they kind of, they disinhabit their body, and they kind of look to the spiritual side of things rather than recognizing that this is a wonderful home and expression of pure consciousness as well. And so understanding kind of where people are, do they inhabit their body? Do they listen to their body? Are they kind of one with this expression? Or does the body need to do and be and behave a specific way in order for them to be okay? And that for me is oftentimes a bit of a red flag, because people, I think human beings over time, we've developed a real intolerance to discomfort. And when we are intolerant of discomfort, we are very quick to try to extinguish our discomfort, extinguish our pain, without actually getting curious and allowing that to move through. So in a case of something like fibromyalgia, which can have many, many disruptions metabolically in the body. It can be inflammatory, it can be metabolic, and it can have to do with the mitochondria. It can have to do with toxicity and heavy metal toxicity. It can have to do with nutrient deprivation in certain areas. And it can also have to do with certain infections, microbial infections in the body. So it's important to kind of take all of these things into consideration. But most importantly, have a conversation with someone so that they can allow themselves to connect with themselves, the deeper part of who they are, and begin to build and rebuild rapport at that deeper level so that they can listen from within, have insight from within, and let that be a guiding force along their healing journey. From that place, it's very easy to start to integrate the nutritional aspects, the lifestyle aspects, the mind, thought, and consciousness aspects, so that these all come together in a really wonderful way, creating kind of a symphony of healing, rather than saying, oh, it's only about nutrition, or it's only about your movement, or it's only about one thing. It's never really ever about one thing. It's about how well we're integrating these things together. And most importantly, how well we're able to listen from within and then follow that insight into our lives moment to moment. So I know that wasn't really specific to, but it's kind of gives you a general view of this is where I would start. And so I don't see fibromyalgia as a diagnosis as much as I see it as a process that's going in the body. And if we can hook up with it as a process rather than a diagnosis, we can start to understand more and more about what it wants to share, where it's headed, and how we can actually intervene with it.
I loved what you were saying about fibromyalgia, because I didn't know there were that many different elements that it could be to do with I can't even say it, DNA, and all those, different things that could be part of infections and stuff. I've got a message here from Peter saying, "Hi Scott, could you please tell me what type of foods are inflammatory foods?"
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a short list. And the list is these are foods that are primarily inflammatory for most people. Those foods, and it may be different. Some of these may be different in different parts of the world. And I'll give you an example in a moment. But gluten in the United States is highly inflammatory. And there are some reasons for that have now been indicated, why our incidence of sensitivity to gluten, and why that protein, the protein gliadin, has become so inflammatory for us. But gluten is one. Alcohol is inflammatory. Alcohol is an irritant to the gut, and the gut is home to our immune system primarily. It's home to our microbiome primarily, and it is an irritant to the system. Corn, especially corn in the United States, is inflammatory. And the reason for that is the vast majority of corn that we ingest in the United States is genetically modified. And so it acts as an irritant to the system. The other part about corn is it's literally an ingredient in everything. So our overexposure to it creates an inflammatory reaction in the body. So we've got dairy is another one. So especially pasteurized dairy is very inflammatory, especially in the United States. Once again, we pasteurize and heat pasteurize all of our dairy, and so it becomes more inflammatory and reactive in the body. Soy is another one that is inflammatory, largely because of similar to corn. It's highly GMO. Humans have a hard time digesting it unless it's been fermented and properly aged. And it's a ingredient in so many foods, so we have an overexposure to it. So that short list right there are the primary inflammatory foods that people generally do really well when they begin to just remove them from their lives. And once that's done, within generally 4 to 6 weeks, people start to see the impact of the fire going out in their system, and the recovery that naturally happens when we remove inflammatory agents.
Yeah, Peter's just responded saying that is really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, Peter.
I just think the common thread is it's food that we mess around with. We put chemicals in. It's basically if we just left it to grow naturally in the ground with all the nutrients that the soil provides, we'd be fine. It seems to be a common thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's, there's a rule, and it's a very simple rule, and perhaps some maybe even oversimplified, but I like to use it as a guide, and that is, when we eat foods that are close to nature, our nature reveals itself. And it's really easy to kind of start to look at, when we're grocery shopping, when we choose foods. If you pick up a food, it's really easy to think, how many steps did it take for this food to look like this? So if I grab an apple, how many steps did it take to look like this? Well, very few. It's an apple is an apple, unless it's a genetically modified apple and it's got pesticides and herbicides. But for the most part, we're looking at an apple. Versus if I pick up a box of crackers or a box of pasta, the number of steps that it takes for that grain to come from the field, go to the factory, be ground up, pulverized, and then made into a dough, and then packaged. So many more steps, and each one of those steps takes vitality out of the food. It takes minerals and vitamins out of the food. And so every time we take something away from the food, that food actually, when we put it in our body, it begins to rob our body of those nutrients. And so it's actually a bit of a vitality robber. And when we eat foods that are close to nature and have minimal steps, they are vitality providers. They literally give us life every time we eat them. They come with the enzymes, they come with the minerals, they come with the vitamins. And what we find, the more we put them in our body begins to crave them more and more and more, because that's what it wants. So you're absolutely right. It's realigning ourselves with nature, and then listening from within and letting it guide us naturally as we open up to the fact that there are so many foods available, and so many ways to experience them that can give us so much more life force than any sort of energy product out there.
And when it comes to the three principles and the nature of thought, how would you relay that to nutrition and pain management and that sort of thing?
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting ways that I make this connection, and one is that we have what's called the microbiome, which is really pointing to the bacteria and the microbial system that make up our physical experience. And just to give you a sense of how extensive that is, the microbiome outnumbers our cells about 10 to 1. So under a microscope, we're far more bacteria than we are cells. The vast majority of that microbiome resides in our gut, where our immune system resides. The vast majority of inflammatory experiences and inflammatory expression is generated from our gut. And when that happens, when we have inflammation coming from the gut and there's a disruption in that microbiome balance because of foods and toxicity and herbicides and pesticides and things that we're putting in, when there's a disruption and there's inflammation, that inflammation is then circulated and finds its way to the brain. And so there's a phrase that is very common in natural health and healing, and that is that a gut on fire creates a brain on fire. And The opposite is also true, because this is a two-way street. When we have a brain on fire, meaning we're inflamed in our thinking, we're inflamed in our emotional experience, that experience also is reflected in our gut. And so we've got this two-way street going on constantly. And one of the things that I started to see with when it comes to the three principles is that oftentimes when people come into my office, their diet is really much more a reflection of how they've been coping with their stress and anxiety, anger, frustration, and so on and so forth, and even their pain and discomfort. And so much of their diet is inflammatory, which, as I was just mentioning, creates inflammation in the gut. It creates inflammation in the brain. And when that happens, we trigger the part of our brain that sees life as a threat around safety and security. And so what that does is it makes us kind of see our thinking as fearful thinking more often. And when we're seeing life through the lens of fearful thinking, we kind of get stuck in this cycle. Fearful thinking, anxiety, fear. I don't want to feel that. We start to cope with food. We start to cope with different lifestyle aspects. And so I started to get curious around, well, where would you begin with somebody if they're kind of in this loop? Do you begin with food and helping them decrease their inflammation to settle their brain? Would that even have an impact? Or would you start with the principles and helping them look in that direction? And I don't have a conclusion to that question, but I do know that wherever you decide to start, either one is helpful. And what I have found is that if I start with somebody and pointing in the directions of the principles and the principles of mind, thought, and consciousness behind our experience, if somebody is having a difficult time kind of really listening and settling in, sometimes we'll start to just talk about the nutrition side, because that's where they can really engage. And so what I've learned is that I go wherever they're ready to go. If they're ready to listen from this place, we go there. If they're more intrigued about the impacts of nutrition, we begin there. If I begin with nutrition, after about 2 to 3 weeks, I find that their inflammation levels come down, their mind begins to quiet, and their capacity to have a conversation looking in the direction of mind, consciousness, and thought is now, it's open. They're ready to listen at a deeper level, and their capacity to hear something from within is much more available. And so that's where it begins. And then from that place, we oftentimes get into the world of food and coping with food and habits, and we can start to see how their relationship with food is really not so much a relationship with food. It's just their relationship with their thinking around food. And once they start to see that food is no longer the enemy, their thinking is no longer the enemy, but they're actually able to see that beyond their thinking is a helpful, insightful intelligence that can help them navigate something that has been perhaps very scary for them in the past, which is the cupboard, the restaurants, the refrigerator, the dining table, whatever it may be. So that's how I see the role of the principles when it comes to nutrition. Really begins, kind of goes back to what we were saying before. There's an integrative nature. We live in a world where there's lots of inflammation. That inflammation can trigger the brain, where we get bombarded by more fearful thinking. And if we can quiet the brain, quiet the gut, and allow the body to kind of fall into its natural presence, we can have more insightful conversations and gain more traction in getting a lot in line with health and healing and nutrition in a far more graceful way.
It's funny when you were talking about the mind and the gut, it reminded me of how I used to, if I get really anxious, it would take it out on my digestive system.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you say you take it out on your digestive system, what does that mean?
Sorry, I'll basically get really bad stomach ache, and I'll get an upset stomach if I'm feeling anxious or stressed.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a perfect example of the thinking is going on here, but the physiological response is going on here. And so it really is a wonderful example of this two-way street. And so oftentimes when we've got this going on and we've got an upset stomach, the way so many of us have been trained in our current world of medication is, oh, I've got to take something to calm down my stomach, rather than recognizing the upset stomach is actually coming from my gripped thinking, and perhaps not allowing the thinking to move through, but kind of entangling with it.
Has anybody else got any questions for Scott? Go ahead, Wendy.
So, hi, Scott. So does this mean following a meat-free diet, or is organic meat acceptable in what you prescribe?
Yeah, I don't prescribe.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, it's a great question. I appreciate that question, because oftentimes people think that what I'm really pointing to is kind of a vegetarian or vegan type diet, and so I don't prescribe any specific diet as far as vegetarian, vegan, paleo, or whatever. What I think and what I've seen over the years is that every body needs something different throughout the year. And so there are times when the body, depending on stress levels, environment, climate, current state of our immune system, if someone is an athlete, their current training cycles, and so on and so forth, they may need different levels of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And their body may utilize those nutrients better in different forms in different times of the year. Now, how do we navigate that? Well, that's really what it comes down to: deeper listening. Yeah. You know, as we evolved, we didn't evolve with nutrition books, and we didn't evolve with nutrition coaches. We evolved from a place of understanding from inside out. And we evolved from a place of what was available to us. And we evolved from a place of listening deeply and then following those insights. And so what I've seen for myself and for many, many people is some parts of the year look a little bit more vegetarian. Some parts of my year and other people's year look a little bit more like it's paleo, or there's more animal protein. Some parts of the year may even look like it's ketogenic. Some parts of the year look like intermittent fasting. But it's all driven from kind of an inside out perspective, where the body's inviting us into something into a direction that it wants to go for its own health and healing. I will say, though, the principles are always the same, the principles behind nutrition, and that is that we want to eat foods that are close to nature. So if we're taking in animal products, we want to make sure that that animal has lived as close to nature as possible, because the product that that animal produces will be the most nutrient dense and anti-inflammatory if it has had a nutrient dense and anti-inflammatory life, which animals naturally do.
So it's just common sense, isn't it? Listening and then common sense in choice, I guess, of food. Just one other thing, just your thoughts on, pH levels in the body, acidity. So some people use apple cider vinegar to settle that, and also some people use Epsom salt baths for inflammation. Just your thoughts, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, way back in my training, I worked with metabolic typing, and one of the things that really struck me was it was really based in biochemical individuality. And one of the things that struck me about that education was that there really is no food that is alkaline or acidic, that it's actually the environment in which it works will make it alkaline or acidic. So therefore, we can't say that all red meat is acidic for people, because in some bodies, that same red meat will actually make them alkaline. In other bodies, it will make them acidic. And so one of the most wonderful ways that we can know is the body will always tell us. And, just like in the world of the principles, we can always know the quality of our thinking by how we feel, right? And in the world of nutrition, we can always know the quality of the way our food is being utilized by the way that we're feeling. If it's providing energy for us, that's one thing. If it's creating brain fog and fatigue, then we want to get curious about what that food is. And sometimes just kind of taking inventory of our food can be really helpful for several days, because food impacts us for about 72 hours after we ingest it. And so sometimes we might not get an immediate response, but 48 hours up to 72 hours later, we'll start to feel a little achy, or we'll feel fatigued. And then we can look back and start to get curious, could it have been this food? And if it is that food, could it be the quality of that food? Or is that food just kind of off the table for now? So apple cider vinegar is wonderful. It's wonderful for digestion. It's wonderful for detoxification. It's wonderful for joints and for so many reasons. But that's not true for everybody. But if you want to test it, by all means, I would encourage you to test it. But then most importantly, listen deeply, and you'll start.
I'm really pleased with your answer, because I've been taking it for a while for inflammation. It's made no difference. So, the 3 Ps, I've been around for about 18 months, and I'm doing the listening, and I'll get there. Yeah. And the Epsom salt baths haven't made a difference either. So it's interesting, but I really appreciate what you're saying. And just one final thing, I have I've become very aware, I've got a couple of friends, psychiatrists, who have concerns about, obviously there's addictive drugs, but I have more concerns about prescribed medications, that the overprescribing and the addiction to prescribed medications. Also, just supplements, people that, we just presume this vitamin that will do something amazing, but they could all be doing the opposite, can't they?
Yeah, because you're absolutely right. I mean, when we're talking about biochemical individuality, not every supplement is going to operate the same way in every person. Now, the other thing that's true about supplementation is that there's bioavailability of the nutrients, meaning how well are those nutrients recognized and utilized by the body. That's one part of that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is is what is the health of your terrain? What is the health of the human terrain that can allow the absorption of those nutrients? And so you can have the most bioavailable supplement, but if your terrain is not capable of absorbing it, it kind of goes to waste. And so one of the things we always want to do is look at what are all the ways that I can, invite foods into my body that that help my gut system heal and rebalance so that it can absorb nutrients in the most effective ways possible. And that way we may find that we need less supplementation down the road. And at the same time, when it comes to medications, oftentimes people are in discomfort because of their lack of ability to absorb nutrients in their diet. And so I always go back to healing the gut, healing the gut, healing the gut. And healing the gut is a process of understanding from the side of the principles, but at the same time, understanding from the side of deep therapeutic and natural nutrition.
Yeah. So a functional medicine approach that's becoming popular lately, and that normally involves a number of things. That's the immune system, isn't it? And also they usually that usually involves blood tests to see, where there are issues. But that all focuses around the gut, doesn't it? And I think there's a few people now in the 3P community that are functional medicine practitioners.
Yeah. Yeah. And, sometimes it doesn't require a huge battery of testing to figure things out. Sometimes it's as simple as realigning ourselves with nature. And for most people, that's the most leveraged step in the process. And then once you travel that road, if there are still kind of outlying factors, then it sometimes is time to do some lab testing.
Thank you. I really appreciate those answers. They're excellent. That's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Wendy.
Has anybody else got any questions for Scott? I think that's been really helpful.
Well, I've got one if I may.
Sorry, on.
Sorry, I just realised I've actually had my video turned off as well, so my apologies. Hi, love the chat so far. It's been brilliant. I've got a quick question, if I may. When you are restoring gut health and you're looking at the gut biome, would you prescribe a period of intermittent fasting or decreased calorific intake for people in that healing process as one of the first steps?
It's a great question, Tony, and it really depends on what that person is capable of. Sometimes the whole idea of intermittent fasting is so overwhelming for somebody that they won't even take a step into the process. And so sometimes it's easier for them to begin just by removing some of the inflammatory foods and replacing those foods with more nutrient-dense foods. That being said, I think one of the most helpful things that we can do with healing the gut is intermittent fasting. There's so much wonderful research now showing us that that intermittent fasting is really helpful for our microbiome. It's really helpful for our mitochondria. Reduction in calorie intake is very, very impactful for letting the digestive system rest and heal and repair itself. And so it really depends on kind of, without being prescriptive, it's kind of having that in our arsenal, but understanding where is this person and what are they willing to do? Where are they willing to take a step? And if it's in the direction of whole foods first, that's where we begin. If it's in the direction of intermittent fasting with whole foods, well, that's where we begin. But it's really determined not so much by protocol, but where that individual is at the time.
Perfect. Yeah. So just using it as a tool in the toolbox, essentially.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anything else from anybody? No. Okay, thanks for your time, Scott. It's really good to speak to you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was a pleasure being here with you all, and thank you all for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.